Nearing the end of life can mean, in some cases, making a major ethical decision. Quality of life, pain, the use of life-prolonging technology, and withdrawing treatment are just some of the issues that a patient and their loved ones can face. A recently released book called Now and at the Hour of Our Death, Making Moral Decisions at the End of Life, helps Catholics who want to align their decisions with church teaching. The co-author Nikolas T. Nikas spoke with Montse Alvarado about the importance of learning to navigate through end-of-life care situations.
What prompted you to co-author this new book?
Well, this book is the product of many talks on end-of-life decision-making in parishes over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And it's the questions we received at the end of those presentations. And what we realized is, yeah, there are maybe a small percentage of people who consider themselves Catholic and just say, no one is going to tell me what to do at the end of life. But for most people in the parishes, they really wanted to do the right thing. They just were never taught. And they had lots of questions. And so we wrote this book to be a resource for the average Catholic about how to prepare before the crisis hits on end-of-life decision-making. Look, if someone dies in a car accident, that's a horrible, terrible shock. But there's really no decision-making except funeral and taking care of someone's estate. But if someone gets an illness or someone gets a chronic situation where it's the long goodbye, as people say, then you have lots of questions because of our modern technology. And technology is a two-edged sword. On the one hand, it keeps us alive. On the other hand, it could do things that 200 years ago, there wouldn't be a question. And so people are confused because A, they haven't been taught. And then B, medical terminology is not familiar to most people. And three, these end-of-life decisions require the virtue of prudence, knowing the right thing to do at the right time. And that's not an easy virtue. I've lived a long life, and I do not claim to have really mastered the virtue of prudence. So because of all these reasons, we wrote this book in a simple question and answer format so that people, if they had a specific question, what does the church teach about hydration and nutrition, food and water? Does the church teach about any of these? We can they can look it up easily, and it's in easy language, and hopefully we lay out the church's teaching.
Right. Well, that's a great resource, and one that I think has a great methodology behind it because it's a Q&A. It's easy to go to. What would you say then of all of the questions that you answer and also the questions that you received throughout these speaking engagements is the biggest issue or the biggest question that Catholics and their families face at the end of life?
Well, the biggest overall issue, of course, is when to accept medical intervention and when to say it's not morally required and you can either refuse it or you can remove it. Now, the church teaches that the principle is easy to state, it's hard to apply. The principle is everybody has a moral duty to use ordinary or proportionate care, but you don't have a duty to use extraordinary, or disproportionate care. Now, simply saying that doesn't tell you anything. I say that to people and I say, okay, thanks for coming, and then I'm going to leave. No one really has an understanding of that. So the difficult question is, so what everyone wants in our technological age is an algorithm. If you always put these three facts in, crank it 3 times, here's the answer. And that's not how this works. This is why, again, the reason we wrote this book also was to say, look, you can't think clearly once a crisis hits. Once your loved one is in distress, it's very hard to think rationally. So prepare beforehand. And this book hopefully sets that out. But that's the biggest issue. And then the church also says that this disproportionate or ordinary care, trying to figure all this out, depends on the, quote, concrete circumstances, end quote, of a person's condition. So if I had 50 people in a room, all 50 people are going to die differently. Different diseases, different circumstances, who has more money. If you're Jeff Bezos and you have to pay $1 million a day for a medical intervention, it's not a big deal. But 99.99% of the people, they're simply not going to be able to afford it. So there's no one clear, easy answer. The church isn't relativistic. The church's principles are clear and timeless. But it's the application that's difficult.
Right, it is. It's a huge challenge. Do you think, and in the questions that you've received, that doctors pressure patients and their families to make immoral decisions or decisions that the Catholic Church would consider questionable? And how can Catholics be prepared for that besides being well informed themselves?
I don't want to paint broadly, all doctors do this.
Of course not, right.
Just like, as a lawyer, all lawyers are this or all lawyers are that. There are doctors who understand the right principles, and there are doctors who don't. The one thing is you can't assume that the medical profession, like the legal profession, is always going to have your best interest spiritually at heart. So one of the things we recommend in the book, not as a legal issue. For legal issues, we say go to your licensed and competent attorney and have them draft whatever you need. But from a moral position, we say appoint someone who is well-formed in the faith to be your durable healthcare power of attorney in case you're incapacitated. And then they can advocate for you. But they can only advocate for you if they understand the Church's teaching, which is another reason we wrote this book, so that people could say, once a crisis hits, or if you're incapacitated, you're in a coma or whatever, then someone who knows the Church's teaching can say yes here, but no here for these moral reasons.
Now, you are a lawyer. You've mentioned that, and I promise I won't make any lawyer jokes. But the reality is that this has become a legal issue that's being legislated around the country and around the world, at the country level and at the state level. Does your book say anything about the growing trends on euthanasia, or does it play into this arena of specialized legal knowledge, but also medical knowledge around the killing of vulnerable people?
So what we say about this book isn't specifically about assisted suicide or euthanasia, but we do make clear in a number of answers to a number of the questions here that the Church's constant teaching is that assisted suicide and euthanasia are grave moral evils. Now, what's confusing for people is, let's say you had a situation, as an example I always use, two patients in 2 rooms next to each other, both on ventilators, and assume that the moral analysis has been already done, that in room A, it is moral to remove the ventilator. If you remove the ventilator, the person dies, the underlying disease takes its course, and the person dies. Now you have, the soul is separated from the body at some point, and you have a corpse. But assume the same situation where the patient is incapacitated on a ventilator in room B, and the moral analysis has been done in that person's situation, it would be immoral to remove it. But if you remove it, the underlying disease takes its course, and the patient dies. Now, what's confusing for people is the same act of removing the ventilator, the same situation, same result, 2 people die, but why is one moral and one not? And that is, people are confused. Well, is that assisted suicide? So the Church's teaching is clear. If you make the moral analysis and the care is disproportionate or extraordinary, removing someone from a medical intervention is not the equivalent of assisted suicide or euthanasia, but simply recognizing that a person is in a state where nothing can be done and the underlying disease will take it. So the danger that we try to, the 2 extremes that we try to avoid in the book is either pushing people to death too soon, like many countries do with assisted suicide and euthanasia, or over-medicalizing people when there's no realistic chance and there's no moral duty to continue interventions. Now, again, that's a difficult prudential judgment, and we hope that the book sets forth principles that helps people. I think if there was any takeaway from this, it's prepare before the crisis. Go home and talk with your spouse, your adult children, your friends, anyone who's going to have a say in this decision-making process for you, and talk about what the Church teaches, read up, form your conscience well before the crisis. If you do that, you have a much better chance of getting it right. And of course, at the end of the day, this book is also about happiness. You would think, well, why is it about happiness? Because ultimately, we all want to try and strive to do God's will. And if you make good decisions at the end of life, you'll be in that situation.
Thank you so much, Nick.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Of course.
You can purchase Nikolas Nikas's book, Now and at the Hour of Our Death, Making Moral Decisions at the End of Life, on Ignatius.com, and find the book through the search bar. That does it for this edition of EWTN Pro-Life Weekly. Don't forget to sign up for our newsletter, The Pro-Life Pulse, EWTN.com/pro-life. Remember, life is a gift. Your life is a gift. God bless.